evidence about particular interventions which have a positive effect on the quality of life of people with mental health problems. Given the multifaceted impact of mental health problems and the many and damaging consequences of poor mental health, it is surprising how little attention has been focused in Ireland on the economic and social returns to greater investment in mental health. And they conclude by saying, making mental health a national health priority in Ireland would be an important first step in realising the potential gains associated with increased spending on mental health. As part of that prioritisation, we should set a target of 10% for mental health care expenditure as a proportion of overall health expenditure to be realised over a 5-year period. In addition to their economic analysis, the authors of the report also conducted research that resulted in the perhaps surprising conclusion that people would be willing to make significant tax contributions to new community-based services for people with mental health problems if they understood the progress that would be possible with better interventions. You would imagine that armed with evidence like that, mental health would be leaping up the political agenda. But is it? Around this time last year, I saw, and I wrote about it at the time, a ministerial statement welcoming the progress made towards implementing the government's policy on mental health services. And I admit to being intrigued because it was always my understanding that mental health has been a neglected and hugely underfunded area of public policy. Despite the growing awareness in Ireland of depression as an illness that many people suffer at some time in their lives, despite the damage caused by drug and alcohol addiction, despite the increasing evidence of the range of psychological and mental health difficulties faced by thousands of young people, difficulties that range from serious eating disorders to self-harm, despite even the spiralling increase of suicide among young people, and especially young males, despite all these things, mental health is not something we like to talk about in Ireland, and especially not in political circles. And it's certainly not something we like to provide for. Which is why many of our mental health services are in a state of disrepair. It's why there are so few adolescent facilities, so little chance of immediate help, so much risk of long-term damage from conditions that are treatable. A Vision for Change was designed to change all that. It was a radical and broadly welcomed policy initiative, published in 2006 and, as you know, informed by a single central principle, that each citizen should have access to local, specialised and comprehensive mental health provision that is of the highest standard. And as you know too, there were detailed recommendations in that document across all the areas of child, adolescent and adult mental health. And there was a detailed funding plan based on the recognition that spending on mental health services had almost been cut in half as a proportion of overall health spending between 1984 and 2004. To correct that, A Vision for Change recommended affordable, some would say modest, increases in staffing and finance over a 7 to 10-year period. So when, as I said, I saw a government statement welcoming progress towards these much-needed objectives, naturally I went looking for detail, and I found it readily enough on the Department of Health's website. There it was, a statement headed, "Minister Maloney welcomes second annual report of the Independent Monitoring Group on a Vision for Change." Bit of a mouthful of a headline. But it went on to say that Minister Maloney, who's Minister of State with responsibility for disability and mental health, recognises that a lot of work remains to be done and is determined to work in partnership with the HSE and other stakeholders to achieve implementation of agreed targets. That seemed a little vague to me, but I reckoned at the time it had to be good news because he was reporting so much progress. In order to flesh out the detail a bit, I went a step further and downloaded the report, the second report that the Minister had welcomed. Well, as you might remember, he was welcoming the second report of the monitoring group. On page 3, they expressed their disappointment that none of the recommendations of their first report had been implemented so far. They pointed out that just under half of the money supposed to have been allocated for new developments in the mental health area had been taken away and used for other purposes. They said they were concerned at the absence of clear, identifiable leadership within the HSE to take charge of implementing the recommendations, and it went on in that vein. In short, the report was scathing. If you'd seen a press release that said, "Minister Maloney apologises for abandoning mental health again," you wouldn't have been surprised. And the truth is that, politically speaking, we are in denial about mental health. It would be good if we started by admitting it. Instead of talking all sorts of gobbledygook about mental health and how much we care, why don't we admit that it's so low down on the list of national priorities that it would take some sort of disastrous epidemic, as if the epidemic of suicide wasn't enough, for us to begin to take it seriously? We will publish reports, evaluations, strategies, policy documents and manifestos until everyone is fed up talking about it. The second report of the Monitoring Committee, as far as I could find, was referred to only once in the Dáil, and that was in a short debate called for by Dan Neville, TD. He was critical of the failure to make any real progress towards implementing a vision for change. In response, Minister Barry Andrews, who was taking the debate in the absence of the Minister for Health, admitted that, quote, "We're not quite where we want to be, but we're getting there." And he concluded, "I assure Deputy Neville that the Government is firmly committed to the implementation of a vision for change. The Government's decision to establish an office for disability and mental health reflects its ongoing commitment to developing a more coherent and integrated response to the needs of people with disabilities and mental health problems." The reality, sadly, is not quite as radical and important as all that sounds. If you look at the current strategy of the Department of Health, this is what you find under the heading of mental health. You'll find a set of outputs or targets and set against them a set of performance indicators. In other words, this is what we want to achieve and this is how we're going to measure our progress. There are several targets, but if we concentrate on just a couple by way of example. First target, progress implementation of a vision for change in conjunction with the HSE. The performance indicators against this target are HSE plan produced and agreed with the Department, and specific actions on implementation priorities are agreed with the HSE. The second target is progress implementation of Reach Out in conjunction with the National Office for Suicide Prevention, and the performance indicator against this target says targets on reduction in suicide and self-harm progressed. So they've made some progress on agreeing a target. I have to say all this sounds a bit bland and uninspired, though it might be compensated for by strong action and a major commitment to resources. However, if you look at the HSE's service plan for 2009, the one that preceded the latest round of cuts, many of which you've been debating, and the one that is now being updated again after this month's budget, to the point where the Minister and the HSE, as of this morning, weren't able to sign off on it, even though the Book of Estimates has been published, suggests some mild disagreement there. But even before all the latest cuts, this is what you find on page 33 of the HSE's service plan. 2.8 million for child and adolescent mental health facilities, 1 million for suicide prevention efforts, whatever they are, and about $750,000 to fund what looks like a public awareness campaign to progress the vision for change. By comparison with the Government's own strategic commitments, this is somewhere between lip service and outright denial. And yet, oddly enough, there was another ministerial statement in January of this year on the third anniversary of a vision for change. And it's another welcoming statement, this time welcoming plans to develop 20 primary care centres with integrated community mental health facilities. In the middle of that statement, however, by Minister John Maloney, there is the following slightly bizarre passage. The Government has given a commitment that funds raised by the disposal of old-style psychiatric hospitals will be reinvested in the mental health service. The